you are someone who travels often or even a little, you know how it is. You return, you unpack, you meet up with some friends, and everyone has the same question for you. How was your trip? Now, there's really only one acceptable answer to this question, isn't there? People want you to have had a good trip, partly because they do love you, but mostly because they really don't have the patience to hear about your terrible trip. You got to travel, all right? Be grateful for it. While the rest of us were slogging through the humdrum of habit, you got to get away and see new sights. So do have the good manners to have enjoyed yourself, or at least tell us you did. And so reading the travelogue of the first century missionary Paul can be a bit of a buzzkill for those of us who imagine that traveling to exotic places to share the love of Christ must have been a 5-star vacation. It was not. I mean, there were moments. Paul was well received in some places, like Antioch, his first success, the place where the word Christian was very first used. The island of Cyprus was a good trip, but the next few stops were full of persecution and attempted stonings. Paul did gain some followers for Jesus, but he also spent a great deal of time running for his life and shaking the dust off his sandals. After regrouping, he went on a second journey, which had its sweet spots. He met a woman named Lydia, who helped him start a lovely Christian community in Philippi. And, well, aside from being beaten and thrown into prison, things were actually pretty good there. Thessalonica was all right, mostly because he left before the mob of angry people arrived to beat him up. He fled then to Berea, which was pretty wonderful, as those folks were, thankfully, open-minded and receptive to his message. But darn it, those rough-necked Thessalonians caught up with him there, and he had to scram. Are we having fun yet? Well, next on the itinerary was Athens, and, well, what a relief to hear that the intellectual community there kind of liked Paul. They were always interested in new ideas, and Paul figured out how to work with their worldview, gently pushing open a door that was already ajar. See, he pointed out that they had an altar dedicated to an unknown God, and he told them exactly who that God was, and things went pretty well. Until he kind of mentioned Jesus and the resurrection, at which point he became the object of ridicule and he left, but not without a few new friends. Still, not a whopping success. Well, what happens next in Paul's travels is explained by Luke in the 18th chapter of Acts, which tells us, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. I wonder how that went. Anyway, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him, in protest he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. One night the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people." Paul stayed there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. In Corinth, of all places, a city known for its coarseness, its immorality, its hedonism, like many stereotypical port cities, you could get anything you wanted in Corinth, and with so much coming and going of tradespeople and sailors, you could also be pretty anonymous. What happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth. It's kind of like trying to start a church in Las Vegas on the Strip. It was frustrating for Paul, even after so much failure elsewhere, to realize that the very people he thought he could connect with, people who worshiped the same God he loved and adored, were simply not interested in his story. So in defiant resignation, he declared, fine, I'll go to the Gentiles. You know, Gentiles, non-Jewish people, definitely not the chosen people that the Jews considered themselves to be. Oh well, maybe they would give him a listen and a chance. Shockingly, they did. And as an indirect descendant of Gentiles, I'm glad they did. Thanks to the Gentiles of the world, the Christian faith was transmitted to people like me and probably people like you too, for most of us are descendants of Gentiles if we could count back enough generations to know it. So I'm grateful that Paul opened his heart to share the love of Christ with them too, and that he was able to do so in a way that reached them. But I also understand his frustration, not because I've done mission work in far corners of the world. I haven't, not in the way Paul did. I've never gone overseas with the purpose of spreading my faith, but I have gone overseas and I have searched for a place to worship. And I have felt a little bit like Paul might have felt at times, alone. Where are the people who worship like me? And even if you can find them, what if you just don't connect? Paul was having serious trouble connecting even with people of his faith. Now, I want to be clear that unlike Paul, I do not claim to have experienced religious persecution. Even in situations where people may have expressed negative perceptions about Christians, I have never once felt persecuted. On the contrary, I have understood people's reasoning. Christians are quite often misunderstood, mostly because of Christians. But that's another topic for another day. No, I've never felt persecution, but I have felt loneliness, wondering, will I find a faith community where I can worship and feel connected to others like me? Because as fun as it is to travel, when you stay somewhere for a long enough time, you begin to long for something deeper than novelty. You begin to long for the things that are the most grounding. You begin to long for home, even a home away from home. And for me, that feels like church. So at age 20, I was spending a whole semester in France, and I began wondering, where can I worship in this place? Now, I lived with a very nice older couple, and they kindly invited me to go to church with them. It was an imposing, very old building, all gray stone, meant to remind us of our smallness. I felt small and alone, even with others there. No one smiled, no one talked. The words of memorized liturgy that I didn't even know or understand echoed off the stone walls in the same drone in which they had left our mouths. I left feeling emptier than before. Maybe there was no community of faith for me in that place. But there was this goofy guy who hung around a lot at the building where our American exchange student cohort had some of our classes. I could never figure out what he was doing there. He wasn't in our program as far as I could tell, but he was often there, maybe just to be near other Americans. His name was John, and he had lived in France for a long while, although his French was awful, and he fit every embarrassing stereotype that I had ever wanted to dispel. He was too tall, too loud, stood too close, and worst of all, he liked to stand on street corners, handing out Bibles and telling people about Christ. Now, in America, I would have avoided John like the plague. In France, I couldn't avoid John because he was always in our building. And in an effort to be kind, I talked to him. Well, as soon as he discovered that I was a Christian, he was relentless about inviting me to church. He knew a Protestant church, he told me, where he was sure I'd feel comfortable. And for all my reservation about John's abrupt, in-your-face approach to evangelism, I finally gave in. I needed a faith community. What did I have to lose? Now, I won't lie, those Christians were theologically very different from me, but you know what? They were also warm and welcoming, inviting me to be part of their lives. I babysat the pastor's children. I attended a Bible study at the home of another family with daughters my age. Now, given a choice, I probably would have found a different kind of church with people more theologically aligned to my Methodist upbringing, but there in France, those people became my people. Like Paul, who found community among the Gentiles, I found my church home among this weird group of believers. And I say weird not to be unkind, but because they were. I'm certain their neighbors considered them strange with their religious zeal that was pretty much unheard of in mainstream French culture. But I was welcome at their table, where Peruvian immigrants mingled with Pyrenean shepherds, and French women who dressed like Mennonites sat alongside oddball Americans like John, and I guess like me. And at that table, we were family. When Paul was in Corinth, wondering what would happen to him, he heard God in that vision say, "Don't be afraid. Speak, don't be silent. I'm with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people." And although I myself never feared actual harm, I did know what it felt like to crave safety, to have a place where I could be surrounded by God's people. And that was the unexpected gift I received in France when I looked beyond my own limited perception of what I considered acceptable or desirable in a church and found community where God was already present. So nearly 20 years later, I would find myself in another strange place, even more foreign to me than France at times. It was called Fall River Mills, a town so small it isn't even a town, but a census-designated area in Shasta County. That's where I am now. And I was wondering, could this be my home? Maybe, but only if I could find a church. And so I visited the one United Methodist church in town, the only United Methodist church for 70 miles, it turns out. And I discovered it had absolutely none of what I was seeking in a church, which meant a Sunday school for my daughter and a choir for me. And I thought, well, this is interesting, but I've got my doubts. But you know, God gave me a sort of vision. I went to the basement, which once upon a time had housed a thriving Sunday school, but had become sad and empty. And there I felt God telling me, "Do not be afraid. I am with you. I'm calling you to this place, and we will do this work together. Let's make this home." And this church has been my home now for 11 years. And those who have come here seeking God have become my family, whether they like that or not. I am glad I learned what I learned in France so that I could see it when I got here. Because no matter where we go, no matter how far away we travel, whether it's an amazing trip or the kind we sort of have to lie to our friends about, God is already there, welcoming us home. May it be so for you too, friends.